Let's go to chapter 2 and look. Matthew chapter 2, it reads this. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and we don't know how long after, just after, he was born in Bethlehem in Judea in the days of Herod the king. Behold, wise men from the east came from Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. Because if the king ain't happy, nobody's happy. Herod's proven that in his reign. Now, as we look at the context and the story as Matthew tells it, he doesn't tell us how many wise men. He just says a group of wise men. It could have been 3. We often say that just because of the number of gifts that we're going to see in the next paragraph. But this group of wise men come, and they're seeking Herod's palace, and they're seeking Herod because he's known to be the ruler of the day in that region. So they ask Herod this question, where is this one who was, now this word's important, I think Matthew writes it for a reason, born King of the Jews. How do you think Herod felt about this? He was King of the Jews, right? See, he wasn't born King of the Jews. He gave himself that title. There was no blood. In fact, there was no religious part of him that was Jewish. Now, sure, he built temples and he helped build synagogues and things like that, but that was more political than anything else. See, this man who the Magi, the wise men sought, he was born King of the Jews. He was a real Jew who came really to the people, and Herod had heard all along that the people were grumbling. He knew their grumbles, he knew their complaints. He often tried to pacify them and deal with it, however that meant. But he knew that they were awaiting the Messiah. He knew they were awaiting a king. So as the Magi come and they say, Herod, who is this born King of the Jews? I think Herod gets a little irked. He gets a little perturbed. And he simply says this, for we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship it. And when Herod the king heard this, what's that word? Someone read it for me. He was troubled. Now, when you look up the word trouble, specifically in the context here as Matthew's using it, it means all shaken up, all stirred up. Now, what has Herod done his whole life? Herod's older at this point. His life's running out of time. And every time, over and over and over again, someone came and opposed him and threatened him and tempted to take his kingdom. What did he do? He killed them. So now Herod's like, man, I've done it all. I've killed all the bad guys. I've gotten rid of them. I can die in peace. I think that's part of what Herod's feeling. He's saying, I just want to die in peace. I've killed everybody. These Magi come. They say kind of this button word. You guys have those button words, right, that kind of tick you off a little bit? You know, for me, it starts with like dishes. See, here's what's going on in Herod's life. He's getting troubled. He's getting shaken up. He's getting stirred up. And I think the best picture of this, I would not do that to you. Come over, Kevin. I think the best picture is simply this. He spent all this time, and then he explodes. He goes nuts. He goes crazy. He can't handle it anymore. He's all troubled. He's all shaken up. And then he says, oh, what am I going to do? Now, let's be careful not to beat up on Herod too much. He was a bright guy. Most sick men are. They're bright. They're capable. He didn't stay in power that long. You think people wanted to kill him? You think there were people that are after his head? He's not an idiot. So he's troubled by what's going on. And this is what I think he's most troubled by. He's troubled because specifically, we have come to worship him, is what they said. See, Herod spent his whole life saying, no, 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 no. People worship me. I don't care if they do it on their own volition or free will. I just want them to worship me, is what Herod would say. So if you want to threaten that, that makes me troubled, and that leads to hostility. So I can imagine he's sitting around, he runs to his scribes. Look at verse 4, it says this, and assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, well, Herod, it says in Bethlehem. Now Bethlehem's like a whopping 6 or 7 miles away at this point. Not far. You think he would know what was going on so close in his providence. But in Bethlehem of Judea, for it was written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So here's the king of the Jews on one level troubled, frustrated because he hears that today, or in the recent history, was to be born a real king of the Jews. And here was Herod's hostility. His hostility was simply this: to protect what was mine. He worked hard. He thought he earned. He thought he deserved. And it was his. He said, don't you mess with what's mine. I've worked hard for this. I've accomplished. And you can't take what I have taken for myself. How many of us like to protect what's ours? We like to defend. And that's all Herod's trying to do here. He's estranged. He's got mental issues, I'm convinced. At this point, Josephus wrote about how his body was starting to decay and his breath was foul, where no one wanted to be in the same room as him, and he had boils peeling off of his skin, but he still viewed himself as king. He still had the power, and as a result of that, he would do any and everything he could to hold on to this. Josephus called him barbaric. Another writer said he was a maniac, and yet another one called him the great pervert. This is the man we're talking about. And his view of Christmas, his view of Christ, was simply, Jesus, what are you going to take from me? What's it going to cost me to let you be born in my kingdom? Because I know what matters most. Because I know what's best for me, and I think this is what's going through Herod's mind. So bright and capable, here's what he comes up with, verse 7. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly. He grabbed this group of wise men, 330, it doesn't matter. He pulls them into his chambers, and he says this: what time has the star appeared? And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, you go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too might come and worship him. Now, you think Herod has any intent on worshiping Jesus? Don't you think the wise men, if they're by definition wise, would have realized that? Now, they had no reason to question Herod. They just heard that Herod was ruler, so they came and sought him. I think that they actually thought that this was true. But Herod, I think, was conniving. Herod was planning. Herod was prodding all behind the scene. And after listening to the king, they went on their way, not thinking anything of it. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over a place where the child was. See, I think Herod at any point could have sent an army with these wise men, but he didn't. I think Herod could have gone himself if he was so scared. It was probably that he was too sick to have gone on his own. But Herod was clearly troubled and messed up by the result of this birth of this baby, and he wanted to figure out what was his plan. So the trickster makes this plan and sends the Magi on their way. He probably gave them supplies. He said, here's the GPS, go figure it out. As long as you come back and tell me. I assume Herod took care of these wise men, and he set them up and he set them on their way. All the while, Herod's thinking, oh, I got it. I'm good. I've got a plan to take care of this king of the Jews. No one's going to mess up my lifelong plan and conquest of history. The text continues on, and the wise men, I want us to know what they do. They worship Jesus. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. This is part of why I think it's a not-so-silent night. I think there's a party going on. I think as these wise men come, probably not the night he was born. Again, it was sometime after Jesus was born. But I think that party continued on and on. They were expecting the king. And the king had come, and these wise men worshiped with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and they worshiped him. Exactly what Herod wanted for himself. Herod had never felt what it was like for someone to worship on their own will. But these men did, and they opened up their treasures, and they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They offered this baby gifts fit for a king. This is what ticked Herod off. I kind of imagine, how many of you guys have kids that are opening Christmas presents right now? And you know they're opening presents right now? You can see the rips in the bags underneath the tree. Am I the only one? See, I imagine when Herod was off figuring things out, he was like looking inside the Christmas gifts that the Magi were bringing. I imagine that ticked him off even more. You're bringing him gold? Frankincense, myrrh, what about me? And this is exactly what Herod was afraid of someone threatening his kingdom. And the fact that these men who had never met this baby were willing to give these kind of gifts really ticked Herod off. See, Herod was consumed with who they were seeking and what they wanted to do. He was holding on to his. And then the next verse says, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they, the Magi, because they had no idea. I think Herod was good. I think he had them tricked on one level. But God in his grace intervenes and says, don't return that same way. So they don't. They take off, they go a different direction, and Herod, all of this time, I think, is sitting at home going, I got him. I got this baby. No baby's going to mess up my plan. No baby's going to ruin what I have planned for the history of time. I want people to know who I am forever, is what Herod said. It's amazing because today I think many of us still know who Herod is, but not for the reasons that he wanted. So I imagine a couple days pass, a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. Herod's pacing back and forth. He's frustrated. He's angry. The deceiver has been deceived. The man that played the trick has been fooled. It was 3 wise men and 1 fool that day, and at some point, Herod realizes that these magi aren't coming back. At some point, he realizes that his plan to save his kingdom was not coming to fruition, and he was outraged. He was angry. It's part of how he got his nickname, the Butcher of Bethlehem. Now, I don't mean this in jest. I believe this story in Matthew 2 to be true. So I think we can read it in jest and we go, oh man, that sounds like such a bad story. No, Herod in his anger, in his hostility, in his rage, he calls his soldiers and his officials together and he sends them. Verse 16 reads this way, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and he killed all the male children in Bethlehem, in all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then it was fulfilled, the prophet from Jeremiah, who said, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping with loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they, her kids, are no more. This doesn't sound like a "We Wish You a Merry Christmas" song, does it? Imagine what happened that day when these officials come in. They were good at their job. They did it well. And they executed every kid under the age of 2. I've sat with kids at that age who don't look like they're going to make it. I've sat with parents who have lost children at that age. There is no consoling that takes place. As I picked up Peyton this morning, I have a 1-year-old daughter. She came running in on her stroller. And I thought of this text. Every kid under the age of 2, Braden, our oldest son, was diagnosed with cancer when he was 2. I remember what it was like to say, we could lose you. But could you imagine the terror when one night everyone comes rushing into their homes and their kids have been taken and there's a body pile in the middle of town? This Herod was messed up. This Herod was evil. This Herod was selfish. He was narcissistic. He only cared about himself and nothing else. And he went to extreme measures to protect what he thought was his. And Matthew tells us this story of the birth of Jesus, I think on one level, so that all of us can look at this perspective and say, is there a difference between Herod and the wise men? And honestly, guys, is there a difference at times between Herod and me? Are there moments in my life when I appear just as selfish? Now, I might not have a Roman army at my disposal, but if I did, would I use them? If I did, how would I use them? What would I protect? What would I care for? What would I hold on to so tightly that I said, no, this is mine. This is what I've earned. This is what I deserve. This is what I have cared about. Now, I love verse 19 in the text. Matthew doesn't leave it at verse 18. In verse 19, he simply says this, and then back at home, Herod dies. This is a significant verse in my mind. Herod had all this plan. He had everything figured out, but Herod could not beat the ultimate enemy of death. He could kill as many as he wanted. He could fight, and he could push away, and he could do all these things, but he could not hold off death itself. The angel appears to Joseph and says, now it's safe, you go to Nazareth, and that fulfills the prophecy that he would be from Nazareth. Here's what Matthew wants us to see. He wants us to see Herod's hostility, and I think he wants to see the wise men's worship this morning. He writes this so that we can compare and contrast, because here's what Herod did. Herod was offended. Maybe this is your first time at church in a long time. Let me just say, welcome. We like to deal with really shallow things at Vintage Grace and just keep things on the surface. We call them slap on the butt sermons. We'll see you next year. You see, I'm convinced the gospel, which is the good news, which is that Jesus came for people that were messed up to restore relationship with God, that actually offends some people. If you tell anybody that you're not good enough, is that offensive? You're not this enough, you don't fit, you don't belong. In fact, we have a phrase at Vintage Grace that no perfect people belong, and if you showed up and you were perfect, you've ruined it for the rest of us. We only take sinners here. We only take broken people at Vintage Grace. Herod didn't think he was broken. That's why he's hostile. Herod thought it was about him. So when someone came and said, there's this king, this Messiah, this ruler, Herod got up on his high horse and he said, what do you mean? I am king. I am complete. I am whole. I have all the answers. In Luke 19:14, as Jesus' life continues on, the author Luke simply says this, people did not want to bow to him. See, I think that it's hardwired in our DNA as a result of sin, as a result of the fall, that we fight against people that think that they have their life for us. We fight. We get angry if someone says that we're not good enough. But here's the reality. I don't measure up. I think there's Herods all over the place in our day. I think I have a tendency to be there. And when someone comes and says, Drew, God created you for this perfect relationship, and I'm broken and I'm fallen, I get offended. I think the second thing that Herod does is he gets threatened. In verse 111, as the beginning of Jesus' life, we see the prophet simply say this, people who you came to be sent to aren't going to want you. Herod does the Heisman in my mind. He grabs that ball, he tucks it deep, he maybe goes Desmond Howard. I don't know if I have any good balance here. And he says, this is my kingdom, get away from me. And he's threatened and he pushes people away, because here's what Jesus says to Herod. Herod, you don't belong on the throne, I do. And Herod has to step off. Herod has to physically remove himself from the throne and say, Jesus, you actually belong here, not me. So I think Herod's offended. I think he's threatened. And I think his guard was up. He puts the stiff arm out there, and his guard was up, and he fought as hard as he possibly could because he thought that's what he should do to protect what was his. And the reality is, all that God was saying was, Herod, just recognize me for who I am. If you'd recognize that, it would change everything. God never wanted Herod's kingdom. God wanted Herod's heart. I'm still convinced that God wanted Herod's heart. But Herod fought until the bitter end, and he fought until he was down. In verse 19, he dies. It's a pretty sad story. It's pretty depressing, because I am convinced that there are Herod types of people all over our society. Herod's fear was that someone would take his throne, that someone who was stronger than him or more powerful than him would remove him, and he fought to protect that. And anything that interfered with that, he was ready to kill. If there's people in our world today, it's their career, it's their position, it's their power, it's their ambition, it's their plans, it's their lifestyle. They're not about to let someone else be king of their lives. They see Jesus as a threat, so they miss Christmas, just like Herod did. One of the commentators wrote this, people don't mind taking time off of work to commemorate Jesus' birth. They'll even embrace him as a resource when they get in trouble. They might gladly accept him as a spiritual benefactor. They're even willing to add him to their lives and call themselves Christians, but not if he insists on being king. This is where Herod was. Herod was willing to be the king of the Jews if it fit his purposes. But to truly be the king of the Jews, then you would have recognized the king of the Jews. That might be a threat to their lifestyle or career, or whatever else they might be hanging on to. They are fearful and are jealous of losing their own self-determined value, as Herod was of losing his throne. And they will guard at all costs their own priorities, their own values, their own morals. See, here's what I'm wrestling with this Christmas. What am I holding on to? I'm not going to kill any babies. I'm not as bad as Herod, and sometimes that can help me sleep at night. Because I'm like, at least I'm not as bad as him. But the reality is, what are we holding on to? What have we done in our life that we say, nope, this is my kingdom, God. I'm not going to get out of the way. This is my plan, my way. And God says, no, don't you understand that I love you? See, I think Herod and most leaders that are angry are so insecure. I think Herod ultimately is just insecure. He just wants to be loved. He thinks the way of being loved is by who he is and by conditions and by power and by fame. And the reality was this little baby came to this little town of Bethlehem that would have loved Herod unconditionally if Herod just would have let him. But instead, Herod was so focused on what it was going to cost him, he never asked, Jesus, what are you offering me? You know who asked that question was the wise men. The wise men asked that, and when you look at Herod, his time, treasure, and his talent was threatened. But if you look at the wise men heard of grace. Now, these were astrologers. That's who these wise men were. These were astrologers that were watching the stars and trying to figure this out, and they heard of grace, and what did they do? They went expecting to see something amazing. So they went to Herod, and they said, where's this baby? And when they found the baby, they gave generously. And when they left the baby, I am convinced that their lives were changed forever. That's what happened in Matthew chapter 2. They went, they saw, they received, and then they gave. At Vintage Grace, we call that our time, our treasure, and our talent. With their time, they went. They heard there was something better than the stars, something better than their life, and they went. They packed up shop, they left everything, and they went. With their treasure, they brought it because they said, if this king is truly a king, if this is the foretold one, we have to give him everything. And then as they went there, and as they met Jesus, and as they left, they heard from God and said, go tell others. Go tell it on the mountain. We should write that song. That'd be a good one. They said, we heard the heralds harking. Michael, you writing these down? Again, this is what happened to the wise men. They worshiped God. They saw him wrapped in a manger, the greatest miracle of all time, fully God, fully man, shoved together in this cradle, crib, manger, in a cave, wherever the heck it was. And they worshiped. Not with part of their life, with all of their life. That's the question for us this morning. Is Jesus just a threat to our kingdom? Is he just that thing that we do at Christmas time? Or maybe Easter? Or maybe both? Or is he everything? And that's the question I think that Matthew has for us this morning. How do we respond to Jesus? How do we respond to his life? Has it changed everything like the wise men and like Herod? Because here's the reality. The way that we respond to who do you say Jesus is changes everything. I don't care if it was December 25th or in the spring. I don't care if it was in a cave or in a manger. It doesn't matter. The question is, how do you respond to who Jesus is? Do you get threatened? Are you hostile to the threat that he is to your kingdom? Or do you recognize your place in his kingdom and that he loves you unconditionally, that you are his, not because of what you've done, but because of what he's done? My prayer for all of us at Vintage Grace is simply this, that we would be like the wise men. That we would hear grace, that we'd be willing to go wherever God sends us, even our workplace and our neighborhood. That's probably the scariest place for us to go. That we would go and that we would be conduits of grace, that we would give generously, and that our lives would be changed forever. I want to be like a wise man. Now, Reggie, don't get upset with me for saying this, but I have this theory that wise men need to have gray hair. I don't know if that's true or not. But you either have gray hair or you need to be bald, one or the other. So I try to fake my baldness. But I want to invite my buddy up, Reggie. Reggie, come on forward. And the reason I want to invite Reggie forward is because I consider Reggie a wise man. He's only 39, but somehow he got gray early, probably because of his wisdom. And I asked Reggie just to share with us this morning. At Vintage Grace, we believe that life's about stories. It's about the story of God, and it's about the story of Vintage Grace and us individually and personally. Because otherwise we come to church and we hear sermons and it's like informational but not transformational. And Reggie has lived a transformational life. Now he's going to be upset that I'm telling you this, but I consider Reggie a wise man. He's a friend. He's a mentor, whether he knows it or not, because people are watching. And he lives what these wise men did. He's heard of grace. He's lived it out with his time, his treasure, and his talent. And I've had the privilege, as well as I see some daughters and some parents and some friends that say, this guy's the real deal. I don't say that very often. I actually want to be more of the real deal, but more today than yesterday and so on and so forth. So Reggie, this idea of time, treasure, and talent, of living like a wise man, what does that look like in your life for us?
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Am I okay?
You're okay.
Okay.
But keeping in the Herod theme, I just want to tell everyone how generous I am. And I know that I run the risk of not being invited to a lot of your Christmas parties because no one wants to hear from the guy that says he's generous, huh? You just don't want to hear that. But I think you'll understand, and because I'm where I'm at right now, I feel safe about sharing some of this. I love to volunteer. We love to volunteer as a family. We love to serve. And I struggle mightily with that, though, at times, because of this inherited pride, the same thing that Herod went through, the ego, the selfishness, all of those desires. So when we're serving, we need to check those at the door somehow. We need to get by that. And one of the tools that I've used, especially when I'm working with groups, is to see Jesus in them. You know, and when I can actually get to the point of recognizing that in them, hopefully they can see that in me too. When we move to time, treasure, and talents, it's easy to talk about the time and the treasure. I have no talents. The time, though, just a real quick story, something impacted me greatly, and that was Hurricane Katrina. Could have done that to a lot of you as well. A buddy of mine and I decided that, we cannot just throw a check at this. We've got to do something. So we organized a team to go back to Louisiana with Samaritan's Purse. And when you actually get eyes on devastation, on disheartened people, on sadness, it impacts you like no other way. And that was life-changing for me. So I came home and I organized 4 more trips. It was kind of crazy, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to explain that in just a minute. But these opportunities are ongoing, right? Everywhere, absolutely everywhere. As far as the treasure is concerned, we love to give. And that's part of this transformation process, though, because it always wasn't that way. In our early married life, we didn't want to give. We didn't know how to give. It was just frustrating. But now we can't. It's so important to us to be able to support our church with giving and any other opportunity that we have. So I see these things in kind of 2 areas, 2 stages of my life. The first stage is the but stage, and it's not but God. It's the stage where, okay, God, I want to give this to you, but please only use me on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? You can be at that stage too. The problem with that is we're only blessed on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? And the bigger issue is that God is only glorified on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So we moved to the second more important stage, getting to maturity at some point. I know I'm not there for sure, but it's where you want to do all you can with the time and the treasures and some of us talents. And I have a short story about the time element. I donate a lot of time at Twin Lakes Food Bank, and a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were serving up at Green Valley Church. They have a regular feeding program every single Saturday, so I would encourage any of you to help with that. But I was serving there, and I got a tap on my shoulder, and this lady said, "You need to meet this guy." And so I went in, and I met this guy, and he said, "I have some food to donate to the food bank." And I said, "Fine, we'll just take it out to my car." And he said, "No, you don't understand. It's $75,000 worth of food." Long story short, we hauled $75,000 worth of food, 30 pallets, the next Friday. And you can't imagine what $75,000 of food is like until you move it. It's horrible, actually.
So don't be too generous.
Yeah, but I say these things only because when you're in the middle of service and you do more, God will equip you more. You know, when you give, the more you give, the more money you have. It's crazy God math. It just is a crazy situation. So I leave you with this. I know I'm running out of time. Thank you for inviting me. I had a mentor early in my life that said, "Reggie, if not you, then who? And if not now, when?" And I would only add, "in the joy of our Jesus."
And one of the best things about Reggie is he doesn't know that I'm watching, but I'm a young dad. I got 3 kids. And one of the most famous things I use is, well, later I'll give time because I've got my kids. Or later I'll give money because I got my kids. All sorts of things. And here's the big idea, I think, of Herod's hostility versus the wise men worship. The wise men are like, "Dude, let's go." We have a phrase in Midwest Grace, "If not you, who?" Where are those chairs going to go? Don't put them away this week, by the way. We're leaving them set up for Christmas Eve. Yeah, that's a big win. But there is this sense of if not you, who? And there's this feeling that many of us have as a church of God has called us here as individuals, as families, as a family, to actually make a difference in this community. Do you believe that? 3 of you. Cool. No, that God has put us here to use our time, our treasure, and our talent. And if we say, well, next year, then we will have missed a whole year. We can do it next year, but we'll have missed the whole year. Or Christmas Eve, we're like, oh, next year I'll invite someone to Christmas Eve. Cool. But they will have missed a year's worth of potential relationship with you and blessing and conversation. And this morning, we're going to do something that we don't do very often. We're going to take an offering. We're going to give you guys an opportunity to give in a corporate way. And here's the reason why. We normally have the For God boxes in the back, and we give online, and we give in the For God box, all that kind of stuff. But here's what we're committed to as a church. We want to use all of our time, all of our treasure, all of our talent. Someone asked me the other day, "So Drew, what hours do you work?" I said, well, it's kind of the wrong question. Because what I do for a living is love Jesus. I have the best job in the world. I'm not kidding. My wife used to hate it when I said this, but I haven't said it here yet, and I think she just walked outside, so I think I'm safe. But you're still here? Shoot. But my supporters pay me to study the Bible and to invest in relationships so that they might know Jesus better. I think I have the best job in the world. It's crazy. That's what I do for a living. Here's what I want you to start to look at your life. I don't care if you're a nurse at Sutter, or if you're in the Defense Department, or if you're retired, or if you have a job but you really work full-time at Twin Lakes Food Bank, it sounds like. I don't care what you do. I want you to start to look at your life like, I am God's and I want him to be glorified in me and through me. So as the ushers come forward, we're going to take an offering. And here's what we're trying to do strategically as we end the year as a church. God has been very gracious and generous to us. God has allowed us to become a church in these short 10 months. It's encouraging. It's exciting. But we want to be the best church we can be next year. We want to be all that we can be as a church. We want to make a difference for the kingdom of God and for El Dorado Hills to be changed and transformed. Now, I see people grabbing their purses. Please hear me. If you don't want to give out of joy, don't give. God doesn't need your money. We've got this great theology called God's sovereignty. God's kind of got all the riches in the world. But what Reggie brought up is out of joy. If you say, man, I want to make a difference, and I trust that in and through Vintage Grace, we can make a difference. We can give regularly. We can give one time. God doesn't need your money. If you're a guest here, can you do me a favor and don't give? You can come back in 3 months and give if you want. But don't give, because if you're a guest, this is for our family to say, we as a church body want to see God transform this city by his love, by his grace, and by his mercy. Does that make sense? That God would use us like these wise men who have heard of grace, who expectantly went, and who gave generously, and who were changed forever. Father God, I thank you. I thank you for the gift of this baby wrapped in a manger. I thank you for the gift of your grace, that even though Herod tried to kill and tried to destroy, that you didn't let him win. And I thank you for the fact that right now at Vintage Grace, you're doing a work in us as individuals and corporately as a community. God, make us wise men. Make us wise women, wise parents, wise neighbors, wise co-workers. Help us to view our life not as what you want to take from us, but as how you want to use us for your glory and for our joy. Thank you for the example of Reggie. Lord God, we know that Reggie is messed up, that he is simply a sinner saved by grace, but we thank you for the grace of you. And I pray right now grace for all of us, that we would be the living proof of a loving God. That this next year, as we flip the calendar, as we go to 2015, as obnoxious as that sounds, as crazy as those numbers sound, may you do far more abundantly than we can possibly dream or imagine. May you use us as a beacon of light, as beggars who have found food and who start to share that with others. And may people who used to be hostile towards you, may they see grace from us. Lord God, I pray for some of the families that are in crisis right now. I thank you that you're using us as individuals of the church to meet tangible needs for your glory, for our good, and for the people who don't yet know you. And all of his people said, amen. If you'd find joy in giving this morning, respond in worship in that way.